This video is about consciousness, the subconscious mind, the ego, and where they exist in the human brain, and why it's so important to understand their development and their function. So my husband often tells me that one of my greatest strengths is my ability to pull lots of different things and integrate them together. So today I'm going to integrate some physiology, some psychology, and some spirituality. And I believe that a good scientist, a good psychologist, a good philosopher is one who observes well. So as you become a better observer of the world outside of you and the world within you, you might find, when you read their ideas, you go, that's what they're describing. And some of them might use different terms or different metaphors or be looking from a little bit of a different angle, but they're just observing life just like you are. So I'm going to give you one disclaimer. Right now I'm going to show you a model of the brain, and it's very simplified. The brain is incredibly complex, and so this is just for the purposes of this video, but I hope you enjoy. So you can see the graphic back here. So in the 1960s, there was a man by the name of Dr. Paul MacLean, who was a neuroscientist. He came up with this idea of the triune brain to help explain kind of the evolution of the brain in humans. So he came up with the reptilian brain. He called this the limbic system, or the paleo-mammalian brain, and then the neo-mammalian brain. Now, I am calling it the reptilian brain, the mammalian brain, and the human brain because this is the part of the brain that most reptiles have. You can see it here. It's the brain stem, and the cerebellum is responsible for instinct, for survival, for breathing and heart rate and things like that. The mammalian brain, he called the limbic system. It includes the hippocampus, amygdala, the hypothalamus, and it's also called the emotional brain because it's responsible for our fear response, anger response, desire, all these things that help us survive socially. Now the human brain consists of the neocortex, our large left and right hemispheres, and it is responsible for our language, our abstract thinking, imagination, and almost an infinite capacity for learning. It is our perception, our ability to observe that I just talked about is so important in any psychologist, philosopher, scientist, any person. The ability to observe is uniquely in the human brain. Okay? So those are the three parts of the brain. And what I want to propose here is that the subconscious mind, when people talk about the subconscious mind, they are referring to the reptilian instinctual brain and the mammalian emotional brain. That's the part of us that is subconscious. And it's the default part that just runs on autopilot that helps us survive. We'll talk about why it's not a bad thing. But and then the conscious mind, the instinctual brain we have from birth. The mammalian brain develops from age 0 to 7 as we download cultural programs from our families, our teachers, our religious leaders, just our culture in general. And it, again, helps us survive socially. And then the conscious mind begins to develop around age 8, and we're able to perceive and integrate ideas. So moving from here into the realm of psychology, some of the most widely known names, Freud and Jung. Now, you might be familiar with the fact that Freud talked about the id and the superego. And Jung talked about the shadow and the persona. They had other ideas too. Again, I'm simplifying their ideas a little bit here. And Freud also talked about the id, the ego, and the superego. The reason I'm not talking about the ego here is that my observation is that when a lot of people today talk about observing their ego, they're not referring to the definition that Freud had. They're referring to a combination of their id and their superego. So our id, or our shadow, I would say, is in our reptilian brain. It's our impulses, and we're motivated by fear and anger and desire. And then our superego, our persona, our personality, resides in our mammalian brain. It's our judge, our inner critic. It's this social conscience that we have that is often motivated by guilt or shame or bribery, that reward and punishment, right? That gets us in line socially. So now I want to make a big point that these two are not bad. I wrote it there, not bad. The reason they're not bad is because this default programming within our brain is also responsible for our breathing, our digestion, the functioning of our organs. It's responsible for learning things like reading, writing, driving, right? And so we benefit from these default programs, this autopilot. Imagine having to learn how to read every time you read, right? So this is for our survival, for our benefit. It is not a bad thing. It becomes a bad thing when we notice that it's causing us or other people suffering. So for example, I might go, breathing. Yeah, I'd like to keep that one, right? Knowing how to read. Yeah, I'll keep that. Going into a shame spiral whenever I do something that my culture deems as bad. That causes some problems, right? So I might want to observe that and make a different choice. So that's where our conscious brain comes into play. So I would call our conscious brain, I like to call it the spotlight of non-judgmental attention. And that's where our human brain, our neocortex is, that's responsible for our imagination and learning. Now, Freud also had this is simplified again, but this is the iceberg analogy, where our subconscious lies under the water. It's unseen by us, and the consciousness is at the top. People often will say that 95% of the time we're running on our subconscious mind and only 5% on consciousness. And really what we want to do is increase the amount of consciousness that we have. And the way that we do that is simply by observing our subconscious. The act of observing it brings it into consciousness, because what we don't see actually controls us. It's our default. We don't even realize it. We do what we don't want to do, right? And we really are being controlled by these programs that were set into motion many, many years ago and are deeply rooted. So if they cause us problems, we shine that light of consciousness on them, and then we have something incredibly powerful. We have the freedom to choose whether we're going to abide by that rule or that program or not. So it says down here, when we observe our subconscious, our id and our shadow and our superego and our critic, without judgment, so important that it's without judgment, we bring them into the light of consciousness. Judgment suppresses things, and if we're going to see them clearly, we must see them without judgment, and then that leads to just insight, clarity about what's happening, and we can make a choice about it. So in the next video, I'm going to talk specifically about mindfulness and meditation and how you can use specific practices to shine that light of consciousness, that spotlight of non-judgmental attention, compassionate witness on the world outside of you, and to turn it on the world inside of you, because that's where your healing is going to come.